Gibraltar, British since 1704. It's a common phrase which lends itself to the rock having celebrated its tercentenary in 2004. Although British forces have been in Gibraltar since this time, it wasn't in fact until slightly later in the 1700s, after the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht, that it was solely under British rule, as we'll find out later in this programme. The rock's capture from the Spanish in 1704 by Anglo-Dutch forces took place during the War of Spanish Succession and was claimed by the Alliance forces under the command of Prince George of Hesse in the name of Archduke Charles, an Austrian pretender to the Spanish throne, after the King, Charles II, had died, leaving no apparent heir. Its strategic importance became more apparent after its capture, which gave the Alliance a foothold on the Iberian Peninsula and helped to control the strait, the gateway to the Mediterranean. Gibraltar's defences are both natural and man-made, and through the efforts and engineering of the British during the 1700s, turned the rock into an impenetrable fortress. With the 12th siege ending in March 1705, the British began to repair and improve the fortifications to protect their new jewel, but progress was slow going. Whilst both Dutch and British forces continued to be stationed on the rock, British influence began to increase in the rule of the town. In early August 1705, the pretender the Archduke Charles arrived in Gibraltar en route to the territories of the Crown of Aragon, with Prince George of Hesse joining him on his journey, leaving English Major General John Shrimpton as Governor of Gibraltar. Prince George of Hesse would never return to the rock, being killed within a month during the siege of Barcelona.
12 sieges ended. The Spanish have left the besieging lines and are now only blockading Gibraltar. The British very soon take over the running of the town, even though it has actually been claimed in the name of the Archduke Charles, who was trying to capture it for his chance of becoming the King of Spain.
And it becomes a British administration of the town from that point on.
We obviously look back in the last programme how the fortifications changed, and that it was very, very slow after that to improve the facilities. Although the money had been made available, it wasn't quite getting to where it should be.
Correct. A lot of money back then was being siphoned off, not used for defences. It was going to private properties of those that were vested in spending it on the defences. So they were literally using it to build their own property with.
And not only that, but the guns were being sold because of their value, being sold to the highest bidder all over the Iberian Peninsula, whoever wanted them. And so, I mean, that was obviously weakening the fortifications as well.
Yeah, as far up as Barcelona, apparently.
In 1706, Queen Anne declared Gibraltar a free port, allowing the supplying of the town to return to Morocco. The first British governor to be directly appointed by Queen Anne was Roger Elliot in 1707, and he became the first British governor to take up residence in the convent. Britain tightened its grip on the rock in 1711, when the British government ordered Thomas Stanswith to remove any foreign troops from the rock. It wasn't only the engineering of the fortifications that were constantly being improved. Weapons of the time were also evolving.
1704, there wasn't that much regulation with weaponry, but that was changing all the time, especially after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713.
Of course, yeah. When you look back to 1704, as you said, no regulation on cannon foundries. If you produced a cannon in a specific area, that's what you produced, and they were provided as was. It wasn't until 1716 that the British actually started to look at standardising cannon, and to do so they enlisted the services of a soldier of fortune called Bogard. Bogard was brought in to try and standardise artillery throughout the British forces.
And we're here at a Spanish cannon. The British were not adverse to using anything they could capture, anything they could find to fire back. They weren't adverse to using their cannons, anybody else's, whatever they could find they would use.
And I don't think any forces of that day were stuck to their own sorts. What they had, they'd use. Now, we can't guarantee this one was used in defence of Gibraltar, as this one was recovered from the seabed. But this is a Spanish bronze cannon, circa Great Siege.
Well, it's a wonderful example. You're going to talk us through the makeup of a cannon.
They follow the same specifications, and the naming is very similar. And you can, with cannon from anywhere, find as much out about it as you can a coin collector finds things from different countries. And this being a Spanish cannon, we can see that. But to talk you through the parts of it, and to start at the base, what we have at the back is the button. This is for ease of manoeuvring the cannon and for lifting and shifting. You have the neck of the button leading into the base ring. Now from the base ring back this way is known as the cascabel. And on top of the base ring on a Spanish cannon, normally what is very clear here is the foundry that it's made in and the dates that it comes about. But you can see through weathering and damage that this one doesn't have that. Coming away from the base ring forward, we have what's called the vent field. And the vent field is where you're going to fire the gun from. So in here is a little thing called the vent or the touch hole, depending on what you're going to fire, whether you're firing by lit fuse or by pricker. So that would sit in there. You then have the vent field astragal. Coming beyond the vent field astragal, we have what's called the first reinforce. And again, on a Spanish cannon, you tend to find that the monarch of the day is inscribed in that first reinforce. The second reinforce holds two things common to this era of cannon. These initial handles you see on the top are known as the dolphins. And on some of these you see that they're very ornately turned into the shape of a dolphin. Beautiful things to see. And very important, the trunnion. The trunnion is where the gun is going to be placed into its carriage, and it's sort of a balance point where we can apply elevation from. A lot of information on the trunnions, again from poundage of shot that this thing will fire to the number that it was produced within the foundry. Moving on from the first reinforce, moving on from the second reinforce, we have the second reinforce astragal, and this section of the barrel is known as the chase. Again, on Spanish cannon, they tend to inscribe theirs quite a lot, and this one in particular is named after a bird, although the name is wearing out now. It says vencejo, or swift, up on the top of that, so we can actually identify this by its own name. Finishing off with the muzzle. The muzzle, or the swell of the muzzle, you can see that comes up into the mouth, and then down inside we have the bore. So in general, that's the makeup of the cannon in its component parts. Whether it's Spanish, whether it's English, wherever it comes from, it's going to be much the same. There may be slight variations on a theme, but on the whole, that's how it works. We have the carriage here. I'm not sure this carriage is from this gun. And I say that because the trunnion is very, very short for sitting in the cap square. A cap square would come across the top of here to hold that trunnion in place, because we couldn't fire a cannon in this manner. With nothing to hold it in, it's just going to bounce straight out of its own carriage. So the cap squares would do that for us.
Well, Pete, we're up here on Orange Bastion. We've just looked at the Spanish cannon. This is a British cannon, and some noticeable differences, especially at the back end of the cannon.
Yes, because this is a cast iron. Now, this is George III era, so it's sort of the same era as we looked at the Spanish cannon, to be honest with you. But what we can see here is, again, a move forward in technologies. Because after Bogard started to try and standardise, the next person to take on the role of doing so was a guy called Armstrong. And Armstrong did away with a lot of the very ornate markings of the cannon and standardised them so a foundry in Yorkshire could produce the same kind of cannon as a foundry in Essex. You know, so it was an ability for everybody to produce the same kind of cannon. After Armstrong came a guy called Blomefield, and when Blomefield, as head of the ordnance, was in, he was a bit of an innovator, and the first thing he did on taking over was write off almost 500 cannon that had been produced that year. Now that's like a quarter of the annual turnout for these things, which he just wrote off immediately because he wasn't happy with the standards. He wanted cannon to be lighter and more manoeuvrable, and he did that by narrowing down the thickness of the iron used in the barrel, but he also put in this breeching rope ring at the end. So this doesn't exist before the King George III cannons that we see along the walls in Gibraltar. And these are batters, these are siege cannons, used heavily through the Peninsular Wars. So, again, we can also see now on the side a graticule. This is an elevation marker. So we can, by moving the coin in and out the base there, we can more accurately pick elevation for the gun.
And there's also another interesting point, and some very sad stories of this piece on a cannon.
This much clearer on this cannon than it was on the Spanish. This is the vent field and this is the vent. The vent is where we're going to fire the cannon from. Now the first round is not a problem. Firing the first round, she's going to be cold and ready to go. Once you've fired that first round, you have to make sure there's nothing burning inside that barrel before you start to push powder back in for the next round. Now pushing wadding in, the action of pushing in can suck air through the vent, and if anything's burning inside the vent, it can set your powder off prematurely. So the ventsman would stand here and put his thumb over the hole. And yes, there's many cases where the ventsman maybe not got it completely covered and it's caused a blowback and split the thumb in half. So by this time, ventsmen are issued with a leather thimble that fits around the wrist and over the thumb, so they could hold that clear and stop air being sucked down into the vent.
That's all for part 1. After the break, we'll be looking at the Treaty of Utrecht, the 13th Siege, and the continuing refortifications of Gibraltar in the lead up to the Great Siege.